Morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Richard, Sarah, and the other members of the Research SIG for inviting me along. I was supposed to be here this time last year. I'm only 12 months late. When I realised to my horror, I was at TESOL, which last year was in Portland, Oregon, and ITEFL, which is normally separated by a couple of weeks from TESOL, started, I think, the day after TESOL finished, and I realised that it was physically impossible for me, without borrowing Bill Gates' private Learjet or whatever he flies around in, to get from Portland, Oregon to Harrogate in time to do the SIG. Although I believe that Dick Allwright and Ann Burns, who were going to be my co-conspirators last year, did a great job. So I called Sarah up after I'd received the invitation, and I said to her, what am I supposed to do? And she said, well, I said, the strand is called, what you have to do, it's impulse for strand 1. And I said, what's that mean? And she said, you're the most impulsive person I know. Nobody knows what it means. So I just want to talk a little bit about how I became a researcher and I guess the journey that I took, and I think it will probably resonate with many of you. It's interesting, isn't it, that research is such a lonely business, and that's why I think days like today are really, really important. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Can you all see me? Thanks for standing up. I was at a conference not so long ago in the States, and there were about 2,000 people in the audience, and I just started speaking. This woman at the end of the room, back of the hall, started waving her hand. I said, "Yes, madam, can I help you?" And she said, "Could you please stand up?" So now Cynthia and I take a little box with us. Anyway, what I wanted to do was to just tell you the beginnings of my story about how I became a researcher and the kind of research journey that I took. And it started very early on in my career. I started out. My very first teaching assignment after I graduated was teaching in a very tough inner city high school in Sydney, Australia, my native, or my adopted native town. And in those days, new teachers were assigned to schools at the very last moment. And so it was on a Friday afternoon prior to the beginning of the school year, which started on a Monday. And of course, you know, down under they do everything back to front. So the school year starts in January, in the middle of summer, you know, when everybody's dying of heat and wanting to go to the beach. So I got a telegram, and I was directed to this school that I'd never heard of. Got up early, got on the train, got on the wrong train, finally got on the right train, found the school, this old Victorian building on the top of a hill. Unlike a lot of the beautifully refurbished Victorian buildings in Manchester, this one hadn't been refurbished since it had been built 100 years before. And as I approached the school, I heard the bell ring, and I realised I was going to be late. So I rushed into the school, and as I rushed into the school, I saw this massive, hulking character. He was in his mid-60s by the look of him, but was still very tall, slightly stooped, iron grey hair, iron grey face. I realised it was the headmaster, and I was coming down one end of the corridor, he was coming down the other. I knew where my classroom was because it was the one where all the noise was coming from. Then it was the room into which the headmaster disappeared, slamming the door behind him. So here was my dilemma. I stood outside the door for about 30 seconds listening to him roaring at the kids inside. Finally I opened the door, he looked at me, and he said, he said, "Sit over there." And he pointed to his face. I realised I'd worn the only decent pair of trousers I had. They were about this colour, weren't quite as fashionably cut as these, and a blue shirt. And of course, guess what the uniform in those days was? And of course, I looked about 12. So you can imagine that I had very little credibility with those kids. During the lunch break, I talked to the head of the English department and said, "So, can you give me any advice about discipline?" And he said, "Don't smile until Easter." Anyway, I had this very, very fractious group of 14 and 15-year-old immigrant kids from all over the world. Had embarked on a career of wanting to teach literature and found that I was an ESL teacher by default. There was one kid in particular that I had a tremendous trouble with. I'll call him Boris. That's not his real name, but he was this huge Eastern European kid, twice my size, and he was extremely disruptive. There was nothing I could do to restore order in that classroom when Boris was in a bad mood, which was most of the time. So eventually one day I had a note transcribed by someone in the office for his parents, and sent the note home saying that there would be consequences if his behaviour didn't improve. The next day, Boris was uncharacteristically silent in class, and halfway through the morning the door burst open and this massive Eastern European gentleman, even bigger than Boris, came into the room. And I sort of said, well, who are you? He said, me father, me fix. And he went up to Boris, hauled him out of his seat, and whacked him so hard that Boris flew across the room, hit the wall, and crumpled to his knees. The father then looked at me, he said, me father, me fixed, and walked out of the room. So there was no more trouble from Boris for the rest of the day, but at the end of the day, he just sat quietly and had his head down. At the end of the day, the class was dismissed, and I was at my desk collecting my papers and shoving them into my bag. I noticed that Boris had not left the room, and I thought, well, I wonder what he's going to do. Is he going to come up and apologise? I assumed that's what he was going to do. Eventually, as he saw I'd almost finished packing up all of my papers and books and so on, he approached me, but instead of apologising, he stabbed me. He took a, it wasn't a very big knife, thank God, but somebody said, where did he stab you? And I said, oh, right by the desk. Between the second and third ribs. Unfortunately, I had this very nice shirt on, and the two main sources of injury were the new shirt that I bought to wear on that very first day of school, some weeks before, and of course my pride. Now, the serious part of the story is I was then faced with a critical incident, and some of you may be familiar with the notion of critical incident analysis, which is a very interesting way of looking at lives in classrooms, and we may talk about that at some point today. But here was a critical incident. I would have, by rights, I should have reported him to the school authorities. He'd have been taken out of school. He'd probably have been prosecuted, and that would have been the end of him. But some impulse, through some impulse I didn't. I was actually more interested in anything else about, well, you know, why did you do that, Boris? And so I sat him down and I said, I want to talk to you. And we ended up talking for about 25 minutes. And I got his story. He'd come as an immigrant. His father was working as a fettler on the railroads. He said that he actually loved learning. He had a passionate desire to get on with his education. I said, what would you like to do when you leave school? He said, I'd like to go to university. I'd like to be a doctor. But I know that I'm going to be 15 in about 3 months' time. I will be taken, that was the legal leaving age. I'll be taken out of school and I will end up working on the railroads with my father. And so it was really just the frustration that was born out of his desire to actually get an education, but the knowledge that he never was going to get an education, a just and fair education, and that he was going to end up in the same kind of situation as most of the immigrant groups that he was part of the community of. It had a profound effect upon me because I realised then, in that critical moment, something I should have known from the very start, which was that if I wanted to be an effective teacher, I had to take my bearings not from my own interests and desires and trainings and education, but from the kids that I was teaching. And that if I didn't know their stories, I couldn't even make a start on designing educational experiences for them that were going to resonate with them and that were going to make sense for them. And so that's what got me. And so from the very beginnings of my teaching career, I became passionately interested in looking at things from the perspective of my learners, and that eventually grew into, years later, I started writing books such as the Learner-Centred Curriculum and so on, that really grew out of this interest in starting with where the learners were at in my classrooms way back there in those days in Sydney, Australia. So that I didn't realise it then, but I was doing research. I was keeping diaries. I was keeping notes after I interviewed kids. I thought I was just teaching, and it wasn't for a couple of years until I realised that I was amassing quite a lot of interesting data, but I didn't know what the hell to do with it. So I decided to do a higher degree, and I came to the UK and I spent a couple of years doing a couple of higher degrees, finding out more not only about the processes of teaching and learning, but also finding out about researching and what it meant to be researching. And so there was the curious case of Boris. So here's me in my beautifully tidy study, University of Exeter, 1975, becoming an ethnographer. I didn't even know how to spell ethnography, and then suddenly I found I was one. I had the good fortune to be studying with a couple of passionately dedicated. One of them was a fairly young entry-level researcher. The other one was a fellow called Richard Pring, philosopher of education who'd come to Exeter from Oxford, and so it was a very rich experience. But the fellow who was supervising my thesis work, I see my naive idea back in those days was the naive ideas that a lot of my entry-level researchers have when they come to do MAs and PhDs with me, which is that unless numbers are involved, it isn't real research. And I had that knocked out of me pretty quickly by Mike Goldwyn, who said that the kind of work you're doing, really what you should be doing is ethnographic research. And so he initiated me into the naturalistic paradigm and into ethnographic research. And in fact, you probably couldn't do this these days, but I did a couple of studies. One of them, I went undercover to a school at a place called Tiverton in Devon. Some of you may know of the West Country. If you don't, it doesn't matter. But it was going through the process of comprehensivisation. A secondary modern school and a grammar school were being amalgamated. And so I spent a term. My cover was that I was a visiting teacher from Australia who was having a semester getting experience in a different kind of school system. But all the while, I was really a spy. I was collecting data. So these are the days before you have to get ethics committees and all the rest of it. Probably that kind of research can't be done these days because if my colleagues and the students and so on had known what I was doing there, I don't think I've got very far. So anyway, that's that part of the story. Some years later, I graduated. I worked in University of East Anglia for a while. Then I got this urge to go back to Asia, so I went and taught in Thailand for a couple of years. And then I decided, well, maybe it's time that I did a PhD. So I then went back to Australia because I was working on local terms in Thailand, and there's no way that I could save up enough money to fund myself through a doctoral program. As luck would have it, in Australia at the time, a radical left-wing government had been elected and had, as one of its first decisions, made all education from preschool through to PhD absolutely free of charge. Yeah. So then the next step in my story was to get signed up as a doctoral student, and my doctoral supervisor was a psychometrician, so guess what I ended up doing? Classical psychometric study for my doctorate. So most people do it the other way around, don't they? Many people, well, maybe they don't these days, but back in the day, the tendency was to start with psychometric research and then realise its limitations and then end up as ethnographers. I went the other way, although I did go back again. I've been swinging both ways ever since. So, reflecting on that little potted summary of my journey, I thought I'd just conclude by a couple of little some small points, a number of small observations that it occurred to me in the early days as a researcher. I came to realise that first of all classrooms are absolutely pulsating with research possibilities. Like many of you who do teacher education, you probably spend lots of times in classrooms. I never fail to leave a classroom with about 4 ideas for PhDs in my head. Luckily I'm too old to even contemplate the idea of doing a second PhD. Occasionally when I'm having trouble with a doctoral student who is covertly trying to bully me into basically writing their PhD for them, I say, look, I've already got 1 PhD and I'm not planning on teaching in Germany, and so I only need 1 PhD. But all classrooms are like research possibilities. I don't see that there needs to be a conflict between teaching and research. I know that the time is an issue, and the time can be a major problem. But if you, and I know that you have many different research interests, but if you can actually find a research topic that is in harmony with the kinds of teaching that you're doing, then the two can be mutually reinforcing. And that was another, I guess it was natural for me, given the story I told you about my interest in looking at the whole concept of learner-centered education and so on, it was natural for me for there to be this kind of this symbiosis between the teaching I was doing and the research that I was doing. I also came to see that learners, rather than learners being victims, they can actually be participants in the research process, and particularly adopting this orientation that the data that I'm collecting, involving them. I tell them what I'm doing. I tell them that it's to help me design programs that are going to help them learn more effectively, but also that I will probably be writing about this stuff as well. Another observation, you know, the paradigm wars, psychometric and naturalistic paradigms, I don't see them as, they provide different ways of investigating phenomena, okay? But neither is inherently superior, okay? They're just different ways of looking at the world. There are aspects of human behaviour that are objective and can be objectively measured, but there's an awful lot that can't be. Okay? And so, while in a sense the two different paradigms represent two different ways of looking at the world, I think it is possible to, in a kind of Janus-faced way, see both of those kinds of worlds as different aspects, one of the other, and that there are different purposes for the two kinds of research. I still do a bit of psychometric stuff, but the vast majority of the work that I do these days is interpretive in nature. Second last slide, Sarah. Both paradigms have similar elements. You know, they have questions, data, analysis, interpretation, reporting, going public, and so on. But the relationships themselves have different relationships one to the other, and they play out in rather different ways. So, for example, when I was doing my PhD, I was forced for 6 months to wrestle with my research questions until my supervisor was satisfied that they were doable within the paradigm that I was working in. In naturalistic research, very often the research questions may be just a very, very vague prospect. In fact, the questions themselves may never be tightly or fully formulated, and they may only emerge at the end of the research process. So, a rule of thumb distinction that I draw out with my research students is that psychometric research is a bitch at the beginning. Okay, that creating the context in which the data are collected can be really tough, can be really tricky. Figuring out the kind of statistical tools that are appropriate and the kind of research design that's appropriate for the sort of study that you want to do. That's the hard bit, right? The relatively easy bit is then when you've collected the data, you put it into the computer, you pull up SBS and go poing. With naturalistic research, it's the opposite. I mean, I'm oversimplifying in a way, but the data collection often, if you're doing, say, if you're doing a naturalistic study involving observation, maybe semi-structured interviews, questionnaires are another matter. Questionnaires are diabolically difficult to design, whether they're going to be used for either naturalistic or psychometric purposes. The big struggle very often is when you end up with this absolute mess and massive data that you look at it and you think, what the hell are we going to do with this? Anybody resonating with anybody? Yeah. We can talk about that during the day. And then all research is messy. I'll conclude by saying, who was it? Was it Ken Robinson, I think, said that most academics think that the body is a transportation system for the brain. But it's important to keep in mind from time to time, of course there's a great deal of cerebral work goes on in doing a PhD, but your heart's also involved, okay? There's a lot of blood, sweat and tears. And that's, again, something which tends to be undersold in books on research methods. And I must confess, the 4 or 5 books that I've written on research methods, I haven't really included. I may have made passing reference to the struggle to do research, but I haven't really yet written a chapter entitled, Research, the Affective Side. Okay? So I think it's worth bearing in mind. And one of the really nice things about a day like today, and the fact that it's been left relatively unstructured, is that we've got all day to talk to each other. So if you want to talk about the blood, sweat and the tears, as well as the problems of making sense of masses and masses of qualitative data, then I'd be happy to lend a sympathetic ear. Thank you.